You know, just to evoke the president's name this morning, it hasn't come up yet, but it is sad, I think, to use a word that the president likes to use when your chair can't really figure out the names of the people who are on the panel. I'm going to try with Melani McAlister, who is a professor of American Studies and International Studies at Georgetown University. Melani wrote a book at George Washington University. It's sad. But I can do the books. So, Epic Encounters, coming out in 2001. In 1987, I told you yesterday I kind of wanted to be Michael Hunt. By 2001, I wanted to be Melani. I think almost everybody did because Epic Encounters came out. A book really that was fundamental in American studies and also in the America and the world turn in thinking about the cultural politics, not just of the US-Middle East relationship, but the place of cultural politics more broadly in thinking about how American history worked in the 20th century. She has just published The Kingdom of God Has No Borders, work that's thinking about American evangelicals from the 1960s really into the present, a book that combines both archival work and ethnographic work, and so as we're thinking about method and approaches to this, something to be thinking about as well. And the new work is on humanitarianism that takes Biafra as a kind of starting point, and that's what she's going to talk with us about today. Just one more thing about Melani. So you go onto the website, and it turns out she has her own website, as many of you do, actually. I didn't realize this was a thing, but it is. And Melani has all these instructions for people who are thinking about getting a PhD that are a little scary, but like reasonably scary. And I had not seen that before, Melani, and it's just that I will use that now as people come and say, is this a good idea? I don't know if people have seen what Melani has done with this, but it's really nicely and very honestly done. So I would say that. Yep.
Very much. So today I'm going to talk about, first just a little bit about the overall book project, that this is the very first foray out of that you have received today, and then I'll follow my instructions from Chris yesterday and offer a provocation, and then I'll talk a little bit about methodology. So this research that I turned in for this conference comes out of my brand new Ideas for a Book project, which I'm describing as a cultural and affective history of humanitarianism in the last half of the Cold War. And it comes out of my interest, I think, from the beginning in how ordinary Americans have engaged with US foreign policy or transnational issues, and specifically the role of culture and the role of cultural products of various sorts in shaping and orienting that interest. And this book, I believe, will be looking at a range of case studies of how Americans responded to different crises, from the Nigeria-Biafra War to Soweto in 1976, including also Bangladesh, the Lebanon Civil War, and ending probably with the Ethiopian famine. And my working title of this is We Were the World, Tragedy and Humanitarian Desire in the Long 1970s. So, a question I ask myself often is, why humanitarianism? I did pay attention to evangelicals as humanitarian actors in my last book, but from my perspective, there is such great work on humanitarianism from so many different so many different disciplinary locations, and there is a very interesting set of specific discussions about humanitarianism that is often focused on institutions, like NGOs, for example, and what the people who do that humanitarian work, how they think of what they're doing, what they see on the ground, how it plays out for the people who are humanitarian, on the receiving end of humanitarianism. My colleague Lana Feldman does a lot of work on that from Palestinians. And so you see a lot of work on how Oxfam or World Vision or MSF does their work on the ground, what the issues are, and how they're received. And I actually think this part of my project came out of a conversation that Michael Barnett, who's also a buddy of mine at GW, orchestrated between scholars of humanitarianism and human rights, sitting around talking about what's the difference between humanitarianism and human rights. Is it the same thing? Is it a different thing? When is it? How do we know? What are the different legal instruments for that? And I went to that panel and I learned a great deal and thought, I do not care about this. The typology of that, the kind of nature of that conversation was not what I cared about with humanitarianism. And in fact, I think I was really influenced by Mark Bradley, on his discussion of human rights amateurs. I really liked the idea of how regular people themselves make sense of the things that they care about. And I'm interested in how messy those categories are, how much they're about moral sentiments, passionate politics, a sense of desire to engage with crisis, but how little people tend to care about the categories and typologies that we want to impose on their engagements, even as they do draw on those rhetorics from human rights and humanitarianism capaciously. Okay, so for my provocation, today I'm going to be talking about the American Jewish Committee's response to the Nigeria-Biafra War, which will be some part of the first chapter of my new book. American Jewish Committee is just one and not a particularly major player in the Nigeria-Biafra War response, but I think it's a really important one for a number of reasons, not least of which that it's not evangelical, so I was very interested in that. But again, the provocation is this. I was thinking about 1968 and thinking about this is when Americans begin to respond to the Nigeria-Biafra War, and thinking about the question of who decides in 1968 that they're going to think about Biafra. You could think about Vietnam. You could think about apartheid. You could think about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the war that has just happened 6 months before. You could think about the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Indeed, some people on this panel have written entire books about things you might think about in 1968. And so why do people, who thinks about Biafra? So just as a reminder, the Nigeria-Biafra War began in 1967, within a week of the start of the Arab-Israeli War of June of 1967. And what has often been forgotten, although it's been written about more lately, is that the Biafra War engendered a huge response in both Europe and the US. It was not immediate, but by 1968, when images of starving children started coming out, and you know the image of the babies with big bellies, that's a specific type of starvation that was common in Biafra. That's when those images started coming out in Life magazine and on television specials and all sorts of newspapers, and people began to respond profoundly. There were candlelight vigils, protests, massive fundraising, lobbying, etc. And originally I intended actually to write a whole book about this, and as I talk about in the paper I gave, someone else wrote that book, but that's okay. There is, at the Swarthmore Peace Collection, 9 microfilm reels of material. They collected all the little organizations sending in their flyers and their newsletters and their fundraising materials, and it's kind of amazing to see how massive this political response was, especially given how little we think about it when we think about that period now. Now, when I looked at it, I thought, okay, given this, given what else was going on, I expected that the people who focused on Biafra in this time of crisis to be white liberals who saw their response as apolitical, who were interested in sort of mattering and caring about the world, but wanted to do so in the relatively safe and satisfying realm of humanitarianism, without the political freight of actually engaging tough political issues. And it's not to say that I think that the politics of objection and humanitarianism is not politics. I certainly think it is. And of course, many of you know MSF was founded in response to Biafra precisely because they had a political objection to how the Red Cross was handling the crisis, or that's at least part of the story of how MSF was founded. But still, I expected any political investments to be implicit. Expected, and of course there is plenty to see about starving babies, African objection, doing the right thing at a kind of emotional level without asking larger questions about justice or equality or race. That definitely happens in the Biafra responses. But I did find also something different, that is, explicit and implicit forms of ideological channeling, in which Biafra becomes a way of engaging a whole range of additional questions. In other words, Biafra's struggle for sovereignty, and I'll just say here, Biafra's problematic struggle for sovereignty, given how fast they were losing that war and how long the war went on, was part of a conversation about post-colonialism, African nationalism, American responsibility, the reworking of Holocaust memory, and Christian-Jewish relations in the US, among many other things. And later, in retrospect, Biafra also becomes part of a conversation about the choices and efficacies of humanitarian intervention itself. So, I'll just turn quickly to key components of the paper. American Jewish Committee was, at the time that I'm writing about, already a very highly respected organization in the Jewish community for a variety of reasons, but so much so, one of my favorite findings, which I don't mention in the paper, is that going through the documents, you see that there are people who, like kids who say, I read about Biafra in Life magazine, or I know about Biafra, here's my bar mitzvah money. I know American Jewish Committee will know what to do with it. This happened more than once, like here's some money. They don't know that American Jewish Committee is part of Joint Church Aid, that is doing anything, they're just like, here, fix it. And I just think that's totally amazing. And then it turns out they were right. American Jewish Committee did know exactly what to do with it. They were one of the leading organizations in setting up what was first a joint Jewish organization, set of Jewish organizations that were a coalition, and then putting that coalition into Joint Church Aid through the figure of Mark Tenenbaum, who I talk about. Joint Church Aid is an international organization based in Europe, but there's a US version that AJC is part of. Now, Joint Church Aid in Europe was sending, and through Joint Church Aid USA, is sending food and supplies into Biafra, running a Nigerian blockade. So that's already our first hint that humanitarianism is not apolitical, if it ever was. In this specific case, they are running a blockade in a time of war. And in fact, many of the various groups that take up the Biafra cause they start out maybe thinking of themselves as only humanitarian, but they end up taking increasingly political positions on the war itself, arguing, some of them, that Biafra had a right to sovereignty based on post-colonial principles, others, at the very least, criticizing the US or the UK or the Red Cross or others for their behavior in the war, for not sufficiently supporting Biafra, for not sufficiently pressuring Nigeria to make sure that aid got in, believing that Biafra was facing a potential genocide. So I'm going to make 3 quick points, as I do in the paper, about American Jewish Committee's activism that I find interesting. First, and again, this is sort of in addition to what they were doing actually in Biafra itself, which was helping to raise a lot of money and deliver a lot of aid. First, I argue that this activism situated Jews in relationship to American Christians as mainstream and liberal religious actors. At a time when anti-Semitism was perhaps less powerful and normalized than it had been in the 40s and 1950s, but still a major concern for American Jews, this sense of interreligious cooperation was a strategy for mainstream acceptance and perhaps even safety. And AJC and other American Jewish organizations were looking for opportunities to both represent themselves as a religious ethnic bloc, like others, Catholics or Italian activists or others, but also as part of the Catholic Protestant Jew tapestry that was undergirding notions of American civil religion at this time and earlier. And so one of the things AJC says when it looks back on this campaign of working on Joint Church Aid with Biafra was, not the smallest rewards of the campaign was the spirit of cooperation and mutual understanding that developed between Christians and Jews. So there's this sense of this has a domestic kind of cultural work as well. Now, the second, and this is connected here very closely, is that the AJC saw this as connected to re-narrating the very recent history of the Arab-Israeli War, which had happened in the summer of 1967, and AJC and other groups, everybody gets involved in 68. So Mark Tenenbaum, who I just think is very sly and very cool, he was doing a lot of work with Christians for many years, including evangelicals and Catholics and mainline Protestants. And he liked to talk about why AJC had gotten involved in Biafra. And he says, in a number of ways at different times, but in some of his published work, the principle, talking about Biafra, the principle was that this was the first time that the entire Jewish community volunteered to join with Catholics and Protestants on an international humanitarian endeavor to serve people who were not Jewish and would not likely ever become Jews. Now he's making a little point here to these Christians, right? You people go help them because they're Christian, most of them are Christian, and when you don't help people because they're Christian, you help them because you want them to become Christian. You're always trying to convert people. We help people because they need help. And this is the guy who's doing interreligious cooperation, but he's making a point, and he's making it gently but clearly. Now, this also happens in the specific context in which Tenenbaum is talking about what's going on in Biafra as a part of the reworking of Holocaust memory, which is being reshaped and revitalized precisely in this moment. But he argues, as other people have seen, but he makes very clear that that memory, that revitalization of Holocaust memory is happening through the 1967 war. He's channeling it through the Arab-Israeli conflict. So he says, when therefore Jews heard the rhetoric and themes of genocide and final solution in the May and June 1967 proclamations from Cairo, Amman, Damascus, and Baghdad, the sleeper reaction to the Nazi Holocaust was instantly awakened. That is, after the 67 war, we became aware of our sleeper reaction to Holocaust memory was awakened, and that then required our reaction in Biafra. So that sort of tripartite set of connections is one that Biafrans too also made. That Jews and Biafrans had something in common, not just because of the lessons of the Holocaust in Europe, but specifically because what had been learned by the recent Arab-Israeli war. That is, in US and Biafran papers, Biafrans sometimes argued that they were the Jews of Africa, but that was sometimes meant to mean they were enterprising or successful or something like that, but also that they were like Jews in that they, as a largely Christian population of Biafra, was facing a Muslim enemy. And so, although this is a mischaracterization of the Nigerian side of the war, it's one that Biafrans used a lot, especially in the early days of the war, until, interestingly enough, they realized that most Americans did not care about Muslim Christian as a category in 1967. Like, that just did not have 1968. That just did not have the traction that it would have years later. And so then the Biafran propaganda switched to being more about starvation. So finally, the AJCs involvement complicated the already complicated relationship between American Jews and African Americans, particularly black nationalists. So, although many Americans kind of instinctively supported the Biafran side of the Nigeria-Biafra war because of the suffering, and there was very real starvation, and those images were everywhere, and people tended to feel pretty strongly that something should be done. And that was more or less developed politically. A strongly pro-Biafran position was uncommon among African Americans specifically, who were often suspicious of any policy that seemed to support the breakup of Nigeria, a great post-colonial success story. And to the degree that AJC and other Jewish groups were seen as part of white Biafran advocates who did not care about the sanctity of Nigeria, to the degree that was how they were seen by African American nationalists, this was a source of tension or disagreement on the side of the African nationalists. And I talk about some of the ways in which African American nationalists are talking about the pro-Biafran side in papers like the Amsterdam News. But also from AJC's view, internal memos show that at least some people in the organization saw the fact of one Nigeria politics in the African American community as being linked to pro-Arab politics. That is, there's a memo that I found where there was a demonstration by some students, African American students, against aid to Biafra. And then a member of AJC writes to Mark Tannenbaum, he sends him that clip about this little demonstration, and he says, like, what are they talking about? How can anybody be against aid to Biafra? Like, you can have any position you want on the war, and he says, but really, against aid? And he says, is there any explanation for a demonstration of this nature other than that they were indoctrinated or incited to do so by certain militant groups who follow the communist or third world line? Undoubtedly, the manipulators are the same that influenced these children along other lines, like supporting the Arab against the Israeli case and what have you. So, you think, I thought I said this, like I thought I was going to have to do some fancy historian work to make the links between the Arab-Israeli conflict and, the Holocaust and Biafra, but in fact it's quite there on a number of different levels. And so we want to think about how that Biafra conflict is a humanitarian cause that has deep political implications at a number of different levels. And then coming back into the definition that somebody gave yesterday about ideology, quoting, I can't remember who, as being a struggle over what's obvious. Right here, the question of what is obvious is very much under contention. What is connected and what is not connected. All right, I'll end by just mentioning one thing about methodology. I keep saying that I'm interested in a history of affect, but I'm actually uncomfortable with the term. And the reason is, I think that what many affect theorists are talking about these days is not what I'm talking about, and I think it's not what most of us are talking about. In the sense that a lot of affect theory really tries to work from the idea of affect as something kind of pre-discursive, an unspoken sense, and an ability to feel something. So Catherine Stewart has this wonderful book called Ordinary Affects, and she just talks about things coming together in a kind of sensibility or unspoken moment that people understand it or they feel it, but they can't quite articulate it. And even Berlant, who I draw on a lot, and Mark draws on, and other people do, who I think is brilliant on this, often she has kind of two ways of thinking about affect, and sometimes it's a thing you can say what you feel, and often it's a thing you can't say, that you have a sensibility of it, but you can't quite articulate what that is. And I think that's quite useful to try to get a handle on, but I think what I'm often talking about, and I think other people are often talking about, is something more like emotion, but emotions that circulate in public. We want to think about, and I'm quite willing to, Sarah Ahmed uses this definition of affect, and I'm kind of willing to go with that the notion of publicly circulating emotions. Often talks about them as potatoes, hot potatoes that people hand off to each other and gather and then hand off to somebody else. And I see that kind of, it may be both versions working in humanitarianism, though not so clear in the paper that I gave you all, but that humanitarianism is built around a kind of longing of various types, a longing to matter in a modernizing and industrializing world, a militarizing world, a longing for enlivening ethnographic experience in a West that often sees itself as having lost some of that experience, a kind of primitivism in a way. And at times a longing for justice, at least a longing for the world to be otherwise. And so that sense of trying to build in an attention to longing and emotion and desire seems important to me, but I think we should also think about it in terms of how it relates to affect theory and maybe claiming and thinking about the language of a history of emotions as still a legitimate way for talking about what it is we might want to do, especially when we're linking it to something like ideology. Thank you.
Our final presenter this morning, Jeremi Suri, and I'm just going to, sometimes you pretend like you don't have to read it, but I'm going to read it so I can screw it up. The Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs and also Professor of Public Affairs and History at the University of Texas in Austin, so I think I actually got through it. But what I really want to say about Jeremi is that, again, like many of our contributors here, the author of multiple books and edited volumes. And the book that I was thinking a lot about the last couple of days, Jeremi, was particularly because of the conversations we were having yesterday morning about, where are the grassroots and where are policymakers and how does that go back and forth. And Jeremi wrote his first book, this wonderful book, Power and Protest, that Melani was alluding to back in 2003. And again, thinking about the relationship between civil society and the way in which policymakers are thinking about the world. And Jeremi, again, for a first book, really remarkable sweep. I mean, we're moving from Berkeley to Prague to Paris to Wuhan and thinking about the emergence of global social protest and then the way that really did have a connection to how détente came down and how the international system changed. So again, a really useful thing to be thinking with as we're trying to put together where is civil society and where are policy elites. Today, talking to us about freedom.
It's always wonderful when people can talk about my first book because it's like your first child in a certain way. It's that first moment, and I've really enjoyed in recent years my graduate students sort of becoming interested in that book again. For a long time, they were much more, maybe just the kind of graduate students I was working with, they were much more interested in my later work, and so I'm really glad you brought that up. Thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to start by thanking Chris, but by doing that, and Danny and David, but by doing that in a way that makes a historiographical contribution, perhaps. Mark very appropriately brought up the rupturous way in which Michael Hunt's book appeared on the scene in the 1980s. That was a little bit before my time. It's okay for me to say that. When I was in graduate school in the second half of the 1990s, the book, or the scholar who we all wanted to be, or we all engaged with in many ways, was Akira Irie. And it was because Akira was doing the two things that everyone wanted to do in graduate school in the second half of the 1990s. We all wanted to be transnational. Diplomatic history was now going to be transnational history. And we all wanted to talk about culture It was the word culture came up everywhere, so much so that it lost all meaning at a certain point within the field. And that marked a moment, I think, when we had moved far away from where Michael Hunt was. It wasn't that Michael Hunt's work didn't matter, but ideas seemed stodgy. Culture, discourse, language opened up space to bring in a lot of issues that for a long time had been kept out of the field as such. And it was a liberating moment in talking about culture rather than ideas, moving beyond white men who wrote books and actually talking about ordinary people in different ways. And it was an extraordinary moment for the field, and Power and Protest, my first book, and even my book on Henry Kissinger and many other works I've done really grow out of that moment. What I think Chris has done, this is a long way of getting to Chris, what I think Chris has done, and a number of others in the room, Ray has also done this, David has done this too, is they've returned us to thinking about ideas. Not in the old way, and this conference is so different from anything that would have been organized in 1987, but they have returned us to philosophy, epistemology, and some of the content of ideas that I think was lost for good reasons in the way we thought about international history in the 1990s and early 2000s, but brought back some of the content, some of the more traditional content focusing on ideas and intellectual history that had been lost before. And I think this conference in some ways is a moment that represents that. And I think we should give Chris a round of applause. So in that context, my paper's on freedom. And this draws on work I've done in other places, but it is actually something original I wrote. I was inspired to write for this. It might be part of my new book on democracy. I don't know. My new book now has 17 pieces that don't talk to one another, and this summer I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. Writing about democracy, I've learned, is the hardest thing. Writing about Henry Kissinger was easy. Writing about protest movements was easy. Writing about democracy stinks. But anyway, freedom is one of those key words. It's a talisman in many ways in U.S. history. Eric Foner's made that point, so did Ed Morgan long ago. But especially for foreign policy. We all know this in this room. It's hard to read any major document that sets out anything purporting to be a strategy for American foreign policy that doesn't use the word freedom. In fact, it's very hard to find one that doesn't do that. It's everywhere, but it's often undefined. It's so obvious. It's so obvious to people that that's what we're about. And we say it and almost hit people over the head with it to emphasize what we're doing. It's at the very base of any ideological foundation for U.S. foreign policy, it seems to me, because your policy cannot be legitimate unless you make a case that it's about freedom. And again, back to my book on Henry Kissinger, that's why Kissinger is always trying to argue that his policies are about freedom when they're not. Right? He feels the need to justify it that way. Freedom is used to mobilize people. This is a point I've made, but many others have made this point in their work, that you don't organize people by saying we need more money. You organize people by saying we need more freedom. Freedom is the sort of mobilizing language of American politics. In Charles Tilley's terms, right, it is that weapon that gets people out on the streets. It's the organizing language. And it's part of our narrative. You can't tell the story of American history without using the words freedom. Think of all the textbooks that have freedom in the title or the subtitle. And once I actually had this silly idea of writing a textbook myself. I was part of a team. We thankfully never went through with it. But I remember the publisher saying, could you put the word freedom or liberty in the title? They didn't care whether it said American or not. It just had to say freedom. Everyone would know what that meant. To me, this is what we're talking about here. It's certainly an essential element of what we're talking about in this workshop. An ideology, for me, is a familiar story. It's a narrative. It makes sense of the world. The world is far too complex for any of us to understand it. Ideologies are those stories that we return to time and again to make sense of the world, which is why American foreign policymakers turn to the language of freedom, especially when they feel most uncertain what to do. This is actually the point Mel Leffler made years ago very well, which is that Americans become hyper-ideological about freedom in the moments when they feel threatened. Think how ideological and how freedom became the vernacular of everything we did in the days after 9/11. Right? And it's dangerous because, as someone said yesterday, it becomes a monster you can't control. So freedom is an ideology, it's a story, it gives us meaning, it gives tone, it gives context, and it gets deployed repeatedly. To me, this is a topic of continuity. I don't see so many ruptures. What I see instead are streams of meaning. That's the way I think about it. Freedom is there, it's a stream of meaning, but the stream will go in different directions at different moments in our history. So to stick with that nautical metaphor for 1 second, right, if you imagine it as a sort of flowing stream of American thought, it will bend, it will turn based on the context of different periods. And I think that's really what we're looking at. It's not as if the older meanings go away. It's layered, as all history is. And so the history of foreign policy, for me, I think, can be really drawn around 2 or 3 or 4 turns in this stream of meaning of freedom, when we think about freedom in American foreign policy. And in the paper, as some of you might have seen, I draw on Isaiah Berlin's work, not because I think Isaiah Berlin nails this point, but I think Berlin himself is struggling in the context of World War II and the early Cold War to understand the ways in which freedom is being not redefined, but redeployed in new ways in a post-war world. And he's trying to define it in a way that separates it from the ways in which the communists are using freedom. His wonderful essay on 2 kinds of liberty, right, it is a classic Cold War document in that sense, and revealing for that very reason. So as I see it, there are 3 bends in the road that help us understand how this stream of meaning around the word freedom shifts but never completely abandons its prior history in the making of American foreign policy. And that's what I try to lay out in the paper. There's a first period, I think, the early period, when it's really freedom from. Freedom is defined, and this is, I think, what Chris and others have been talking about. Jay has written about this too. Ernie May wrote about this. It's that period when Americans don't see themselves as isolated, but see the definition of freedom as what they are not the old world, not part of those systems. And one can see this throughout various important documents in American foreign policy at that time. Washington's Farewell Address, it seems to me, is pregnant with meaning on this, as is the Monroe Doctrine. I won't rehearse all of that for you, except to make the point that both of those doctrines are infused with discussions of freedom, but they're discussions of what the United States will not do, not what the United States will do, right? So for Washington, it's avoiding the entanglements of alliance and avoiding war, not being part of that old war. And for the Monroe Doctrine, it's avoiding the actions that would either support foreign powers coming back into South America or the United States taking a role itself, a direct role itself. It's neither of those 2 things. Nick had a wonderful discussion of John Quincy Adams. That's probably John Quincy Adams' most brilliant moment as a foreign policy thinker. And as I've read his letters around that moment, I don't know his work as well as Nick, it's extraordinary how often he defines the Monroe Doctrine as a defense of freedom, right? Freedom from. I think the period after the Civil War, and when exactly we can debate this, I have a more traditionalist view. Matt was caricaturing it, but I actually think there's something to the Beardian view, that the Civil War is the triumph of industrial capitalism. And I think the Republican Party was the party of industrial capitalism. We could have a whole discussion of that, and Matt knows this far better than I do. But I do think the period after the Civil War is a period when the notion of freedom, not just at home, as many have written about, but also abroad, is being actively redefined. And this has always been the central insight, by the way, of Walter Lefebvre's work for me. That sort of central section of the New Empire where he talks about the ideological formation has always been central to the way I think about this. And William Henry Seward, who came up yesterday, I think in Matt's paper, is a key actor here. Coming out of the Civil War, Republican Party policy was that the United States needed more opportunity, more resources, not always more markets. I think the William Williams approach oversimplified that a little bit, but of course there's still a strong kernel of truth to it. The desire to find more markets, more space for a more hungry and productive economy. That's what the Homestead Act is about. That's what the Moral Land Grant Act is about. Which is the land grant? Is it Ohio State? Is it Oregon State? Or is it Oregon State? Is it the land grant? So we're here, thanks to Republican Party policy in 1862, the Moral Land Grant, right, which had been voted against by the Democrats. It gets through because the Democrats are out of Congress, of course, in 1862. It's about finding land. It's about finding resources for the United States. Freedom to produce. Freedom to produce. Seward is very explicit about this. That's what the Alaska Purchase is about. That's what the Midway Islands are about. Daniel Immerwahr's new book is filled with wonderful stories about this, right? Guano and various other elements of what Daniel argues becomes the beginnings of an empire that we don't want to talk about. as such, right? And you can see that in the direct discussion and argument for this. Freedom is now not simply staying away. It's not a restrictive element. It's now an accessible element. It's freedom too. This comes up most explicitly in the two leaders in the early 20th century who are most conscious of this history and see themselves in direct dialogue with this history. Writing the recent book on the presidency, this was the most fun part for me, to see how much Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson actually took history seriously and did things with it that historians would never say they could do, which is to say deploy history to actually manufacture more executive power for themselves. We have a bias against that, I think, as historians. We're context-driven. We're skeptical of individuals being able to dominate the historical narratives that we tell. These two men studied historical narratives, in TR's case, wrote many themselves, and deployed it for their own executive purposes. As such, the Roosevelt corollary, I think, is very much this argument. It's filled with the notion that the United States must have the freedom to, in Roosevelt's terms, bring sanitary conditions and appropriate governance to those countries around us. It's the first time at that level that an American foreign policy leader talks of police action abroad. You could find antecedents in the treatment of Native Americans at home. You could find domestic antecedents. This is the first major foreign policy articulation of a police action power for the United States. Woodrow Wilson, despite his differences with TR, draws on this, and we all know this story, but it's worth just highlighting, that Woodrow Wilson is actually more interventionist in the Western Hemisphere than Theodore Roosevelt is. Right? And that's not surprising. People forget that when they just read his language. But that's not surprising because all the language of freedom and making the world safe for democracy is actually about an expansive use of freedom. He's using it in self-consciously different ways from Washington and Quincy Adams. And he's explicit about that in his own right. He's in direct dialogue on that. So this is one of those moments you can see the streams of meaning changing self-consciously by the figures themselves in that position. It's a rare moment in history when you can actually find the figures saying this as explicitly as these two men are. I think after World War II, or during World War II, I should say, and whether one wants to date this from the end of the Depression or the war itself or the end of the war, we can debate that. I think there's a very strong argument Michael Sherry makes that the New Deal is actually really the first step of the war as such. But regardless of where we want to date it, the mid-20th century marks another shift, another self-conscious shift. And Franklin Roosevelt, who came up in McAlister's paper and in other discussions, I think is at the center of this. I think he's also very self-conscious of this. The Four Freedoms speech in January of 1941, if you look at the writing and rewriting of it, it's so interesting to look at FDR's speeches. Many in this room have. Mark has many. I mean, there's so many direct word changes by FDR himself. He's so engaged in thinking about this. Sam Roseman talks about how Roosevelt would read stuff, circle phrases, send them to Roseman. Roseman would collect them, and then Roosevelt would deploy them when appropriate. And I think he was very self-conscious of redefining freedom for an isolationist nation where he had legal restrictions on what he could do for what he saw as a new world. And this is a period now when the United States is moving from an expansive vision of freedom to a more hegemonic vision of freedom. He almost says that at times. He doesn't use the word hegemony. But at times he comes close to very much saying the world can only be safe if the United States now dominates the world, or is close to that kind of position. The Four Freedoms speech is really interesting. In this, the first two freedoms, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, are the obvious ones. Freedom from fear and freedom from want. Freedom from fear and freedom from want. And he's deft in never in the speech saying the United States will itself make that happen, but he's very explicit that it is part of a larger American project. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want for all peoples everywhere. It's breathtaking. That he says it in January 41 in an isolationist country. The Atlantic Charter in August of 41, before the United States has entered the war. By the way, it's interesting how many people get that wrong, that they think the Atlantic Charter is a war document. It's before the United States is in the war. He very explicitly forces this vision on Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is brought kicking and screaming into what Roosevelt self-consciously sees as a replacement of the British Empire, but not simply with anti-imperialism, with an American-dominated world order of freedom, freedom over these places. The place that Roosevelt's thinking about most, of course, is India at this time. There's wonderful scholarship on this. Liz Borgwar, Kiran Patel. Three of my students are books that just came out this year, so I'm going to advertise their books. Jennifer Miller on Japan. Her book looks at the ways in which the United States redefines what it means to be a Japanese free society with freedom defined by American Constitution writing. David Field has a book that's coming out in about a month on Korea and Syngman Rhee and how Syngman Rhee plays to this. It's really a story of Syngman Rhee's sort of doing what Diem does, right? Playing to American definitions and assumptions of freedom. And then Dan Hummel, my student, his book was just out now as well, on the beginnings of Israeli politics in this context. And the ways and the early connections that then really reached fruition in the 1970s between Christian evangelicals and Israeli politicians. It's a really interesting story. Draws on a lot of Melani's work, actually. What I think we see with the Marshall Plan, with the National Security Act of 1947, and we could go on and on and on here, is the hyper use of freedom, not as manipulation, but as a sincere belief that the United States now has a role to play in the world by, in a certain way, imposing a particular view of freedom, particular view of markets, particular view of individual liberties, explicit constitution writing in various parts of the world. And that, I think, is the story of the Cold War that we all know very well. The 21st century brings us, I think, to this fourth period, which is also what makes this conference and this volume so interesting, because I think we're at another bend in the road. We don't know exactly where it's going, but there could have been no better evidence than last night's presentation by my friend Jim Lindsay. Jim seemed so out of place and out of touch last night, didn't he? He's a good guy, but what he was saying is not here. And I'm not criticizing him. He was doing what he's supposed to do, and he did it well, right? But this sort of standard, what I think Daniel called status quo anti-liberal internationalism, which is this hegemonic view of freedom, right? It doesn't work, right? We might disagree on what the replacement is, but it doesn't work, right? It was almost as if you were hearing someone speak from a decade earlier there, right? And again, that's no critique of him individually. I think that's a moment when the streams of meaning have changed. As a consequence of the Iraq War and many, many other things, and by the way, now I will mention he who shall not be named, no Iraq War, no Donald Trump, I would argue, right? Without the Iraq War, and all the people who think George W. Bush is not so bad now, we need to reconcile themselves with that, right? There's a whole story about that. I've written about it elsewhere. I think it's quite clear, actually, for all kinds of reasons. The Iraq War discredits most of the anchors, most of the assumptions behind this hegemonic view of freedom. And we're in this moment of crisis. Maybe here is the rupture. We're in this moment now where we are redefining, especially in foreign policy, what a freedom agenda looks like. What does it mean to believe, as we still do as a society, that foreign policy must be centered on some notion of freedom? All the questions that you guys raised with Jim were about that, right? Matt's question was, right, how can 4% of the world define the world for everyone else, right? At some level, right, freedom remains in American thinking the foundation for the legitimate use of power. But not knowing what that is in this context says we're in one of these new moments. Here's my prediction. Historians shouldn't make predictions, but I will. We're moving toward a fourth definition of freedom that is going to involve environment, climate, sustainability in some way in which it hasn't before. That's maybe an obvious thing to say. But the language, the meaning, the story is changing before our eyes. My provocation for today is for us really to try to look at these connections across our history. It's dangerous because you can elide a lot of detail. And there is always this trade-off between what John Gaddis always called lumpers and splitters, right? And we need both. But it does seem to me that when we're talking about ideology, not just ideas, when we're talking about ideology, the central insight, right, is that they have long histories. And long histories of shifts and reshifting meanings over time. And to interrogate those meanings really does require, I think, a broader historical perspective. And it brings us back to Akira Irie, where I really wanted to close. Akira was always my hero because I thought what he did was he allowed Americans to see the meaning of American power in East Asia in ways that were not the traditional realist American-centered ways of seeing American power in the region. And that was a long-term, career-long project. And it was about defining the meaning of American ideas in a context of the world that he had lived through and that he had spent his career writing about. I think that's the space we're in right now. Final point, I think we as historians have an obligation to do this, because not just because it's our job, but because ideas and ideologies are deployed by foreign policymakers all the time. They actually generally win their arguments, I'm certain, not because they make cases about interests, but because they make ideologically persuasive arguments. That was always the strength of George Kennan. Frank Castiglione has been very explicit about this. Always the strength of Henry Kissinger. Always the strength of someone like a Condoleezza Rice. Right? It's not knowing the details of policy in the material terms we normally talk about. It's about making the persuasive arguments. Right? It is our job to provide citizens and students in particular with the historical framework to actually themselves understand, unpack, and remake these arguments. And that's what I think this kind of ideological analysis can do. I want my students more than anything else to understand that freedom is central to American thinking, but it's a dynamic, complex topic. And every time they hear that word, especially connected to the use of power, they should be thinking about this history and rethinking how it should be deployed today. And if our book does a little bit of that, that's a big accomplishment. Thank you.
All right, lots on the table. Let's see if I can manage to run a Q&A. Who'd like to get in? Yeah?
Those are all great papers. Lots of questions, but I just want to ask one to Imaobong, which is about the UN. And I'm so fascinated at S.E. Robeson's sense of kind of possibility and excitement about the UN. And I just wondered if you could maybe take the story forward, because she's around until the mid-60s, is that right? So this sense initially that the problem with the UN is that the US is putting up people who are kind of tokenist African Americans who are all anti-communist, and also that the rest of the world is not necessarily placing pressure on the UN in a way that means it can do the thing it was supposedly invented for. I mean, obviously it wasn't invented to be, an instrument for black internationalism, right? I mean, it was invented to preserve this kind of post-World War II US government world order. So at what point does her faith in the UN subside? Or at what point does she become disillusioned with what the UN clearly is? Or does she retain a faith in it being something else all the way through to the end?
That's a good question. I think she does retain a sense of faith up until the end. I think there's an enduring optimism in Robeson's thoughts. And this is clear in her writings in the 1950s, in particular in New World Review. And when she stops writing for New World Review and she actually relocates to London in the 1960s before her death, even her writings to friends, she's still kind of calling on them to kind of even put pressure more on the UN and the actors who are working within the UN and other radical black activists as well. So I would say that the politics of hope really does endure for Robeson.
I had a question for Daniel and a question for Jeremy. I guess it was one of the categories that you created there. I was hoping you could elaborate a bit more on. That was the free market expansionist. I was really struck by the examples that you used there of Alexander Hamilton as a free market expansionist and as pro-immigrant, because that's not how I tend to think of Alexander Hamilton. I tend to think of imported manufacturers as a kind of something quite different from free markets. And in fact, I often thought of him as very an advocate for immigration restrictions in other places, maybe not so much in that text. But so I'd be curious why you chose that. And similar for Carnegie in the late 19th century, he was, of course, he made his fortunes in no small part because of the massive tariffs on steel. And it's only later life, around when he founds the Carnegie note, that at least I found that he becomes an advocate for free trade, free markets. And so those two examples are interesting there, but I imagine you've got your reasons for it, and I'd like to hear that. And Jeremy, the freedom to produce in the late 19th century, I think is really, in many ways, I agree with, but I wonder if there's still, at least if you take a broader viewpoint here, it's still very much freedom from as well. That freedom to produce is also the story of freedom from the British-dominated global market system. That's the way that they see themselves as to produce freely. And that's how you have James Blaine's vision for an American system that's non-European, non-British, in Latin, moving markets in Latin America, or Emily Rosenberg's amazing financial missionaries to the world about creating an alternative gold standard system that's centered in New York City, not in London. So I mean, in a way, I agree with you, but I also think there's still that element of freedom from that's kind of overarching all of that. So.
Okay, so I'll jump in first. So I was looking through, hoping I had some quotes I could pull out, but I don't have it with me. So you have to look in the paper for some of the stuff from reported manufacturers. I think what I'm not necessarily wedded to the free market component of that as kind of the descriptor for the group, but what they have in common is sort of this insatiable appetite for cheap immigrant labor. So that's the core. So, if there's a way to reframe it so that there's more comfort in that description, Hamilton's fascinating. So I don't know how much you know about kind of the latter day Hamilton on this stuff, but he's with the Federalists, right? And we always think of the Alien Sedition Act with the Federalists and so forth, but he definitely moves away in very significant ways from the stronger nativist strains of that group. And a lot of it's about American prosperity and growth, and in some ways, actually, at early stages of this, there's a lot of, I would say, resonance, surprisingly, with Madison in terms of, look at the colonies that have done well. They're the ones that have encouraged migration. They're the ones who've made the most of this labor opportunity. And so there are nuances there that I suspect if we had a long conversation, we would agree on. So it may be a sin for any of us who are Carnegie fellows to have anything ill about Andrew Carnegie. I don't know. They might come calling for that check, I don't know. So it's very dangerous. But the same thing about, he definitely is talking and thinking about access to these immigrant laborers who are going to be so crucial for the machine, right? So we can talk more at some point. You can set me straight on certain things I'm missing.
No, I like it. Maybe market extensions.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. So immigrant labor enthusiasts or something.
So Mark, I completely agree that as we talk of different bends in the road and the streams of meaning, the old waters don't go away, right? I mean, everything is layered, and you're so correct. What actually people often forget is, the United States' primary concern in terms of international affairs in the late 19th century was Great Britain. It was a hostile relationship. There's no special relationship at that point at all. So there is this sense of still wanting to be free from the stranglehold of British imperialism and dominance of the sea in particular. That's there, but that's now fused also with a much more outward-looking. Your own work shows this. Tariff policies were very much about two things, right? Again, I'm just drawing on your work. Providing revenue to the federal government, that's where the revenue comes from, and second, providing the industrial base at home to actually produce and compete internationally. So it's not that the old desire to define freedom in a Washingtonian sense goes away, but it's now fused with a much more outward-looking, expansive vision. And those two historical meanings then get fused again with a more hegemonic aspiration. And that's what makes this so interesting, because that's where the debates are. The debates are not to reject one or the other. The debates are the relative weights to give these things. So when Chris yesterday talked about unilateralism, I was sitting thinking, sure, it's always there, but it's leavened by other competing elements. And what we study, I think, is the way, again, that my metaphor of a complex cocktail, right? The way in which different ingredients are being mixed by different actors at different moments.
Yeah. Hi. Consider another bend in the stream of freedom. And I'm going off of this book, Dark Money by Jane Miner. Sure. I don't know if you've seen it or not.
I've actually read it.
You've read it. Good. So I think there's a bend which has been, to counter your point about, this bring the freedoms from Roosevelt hasn't been working. I think it stopped working because of this bend, which is basically the freedom for economic plunder, which starts at the end of the 60s and the 70s in response to the events of the time, and really has organized modern republicanism in the country. And it's veiled behind the freedom, we're going to bring democracy to Iraq and those kind of things. But
yes. I completely agree. Yeah. I think it's part of, it's what sounds like libertarian rhetoric is actually hegemonic rhetoric, right? And so I agree with you 100%.
I'm always trying to formulate a question for several people to put things in conversation, and I do find the frame of of freedom and those very powerful and different elements, and within that you can bring a lot of challenges to mainstream notions of freedom. And so I'm just kind of thinking of drawing on several people in the panel to address some of those moments. And I'm not challenging the frame. I kind of like it. I think but some of these other threats. So I'm thinking, at the moment of the Atlantic Charter, I mean, my earliest work on sort of anti-colonial and Black transnationalism, it's the anti-colonialists that pick up this notion of the Atlantic Charter and what that means. So that really comes out of a Black diasporic and a broader Afro-Asian. And that's really, really pushed on the agenda. And then I'm going to kind of jump all over, but like the notion of freedom from the moment of emancipation, emancipated people are saying, we have nothing but freedom. Sort of like what is the content of this when no money, no job, or there's really like nothing there. And that language comes up again when U.S. corporations are moving into Africa in the 50s. We're free to starve. We're free to have brutal conditions. Thank you. What is this American freedom? So this is, and obviously, civil rights movement, anti-colonialism, it's putting all this stuff in the middle. And likewise, I mean, big keyword civilization. I mean, my favorite, attributed to, Gandhi, what do you think Western civilization? That would be a great idea. So this is, these words are really, kind of really, taken up and challenged. And then I'm going to go in one other kind of direction, but I think if we were to think about why, and I agree with you that Iraq is like really a breaking moment for something, a liberal internationalism that's already been challenged. It makes no sense, but it's also sitting with, and I'm trying to think through this, is really the most radical part of a neoliberal project is, and I think of Thatcher, there's no society, there's only an individual. This idea, you free the person from that society, from any social bonds. It's not owed to them by a government. They're not supposed to be connected to other people. It's a sort of a radical attack on, sort of human sociality in that kind of way. So, and that's just bizarre. That's a big part of it. It's like freedom from society, and we can talk about if that's aggressively pursued by particular corporations, because sort of seen some of that, but I won't even go into that. But so that is a really, that's a really like pernicious but profoundly operative sense of freedom that's going on right now. So I just, and I'm hoping, that like that would address like, how is that kind of play with language or pushing back? I think everything from really all of the panelists and Melani's kind of work too, because again, like freedom that's very operative in civil rights and anti-colonialism. So so anybody, kind of every freedom. No, it's connected to freedom to plunder.
Do you want to do this? Seems like obviously you
Can you think about it?
Yeah. So I don't know if I have a great answer to this, and maybe Jeremy and others can speak, but I'll just say quickly that thinking off the cuff, I am not sure that the example that I was talking about in terms of thinking about activists who are talking about Nigeria, the Nigerian Civil War, I don't think freedom is much of the issue. I think security is an issue. Not in American national security, but actually the security of people not to die from starvation. And questions of the Civil War and genocide are everywhere. Again, I think part of the issue is maybe it is an issue in the sense that people are, the tension between security and safety in the context of the war and the starvation, but also the argument for Biafra is built on notions of post-colonial notions of the freedom to self-determination. And so that becomes more, as people begin sort of talking about supporting Biafra's right to secession, and they do support it more and more, they use the language of post-colonialism to do that. This is Leslie Harriton's book on this is called Post-Colonial Humanitarianism, and it looks at that question of like how people get sort of captured by the language of post-colonialism. So obviously then, and people like Brad Simpson and others have talked about this, the ways that that notion of self-determination sort of gets contested, because at the same time, Biafra should have the right to secede. That's a post-colonial argument. Nigeria should be whole. That's a post-colonial argument. Right? One Nigeria is a successful post-colonial state, and it should stay whole and not be. And this is why the Nigeria-Biafra War is one of the few places in this period, well, really in the whole Cold War, it's one of the few, maybe the only one where the US, the Soviet Union, and the Organization of African Unity are all on the same side, which is Nigeria's side. And they all do so for the same reasons around this question of like, how much does this, where is this post-colonial thing going to go, and how many small states are we going to get as a result? Yeah, I guess you could, I don't see it as kind of the animating language of American activists, and I don't really see it as the animating language of even the foreign policy discussions about it, or the Biafran discussions about it, except to the degree that it kind of quietly underpins the notion of the right to society.
Yeah, really interesting panel. I guess I was going to sort of a comment on Jeremy's like schema that then maybe will allow opportunities for you guys to jump in, because I mean I was thinking about the way, I mean there's a kind of what you could call your sort of like ironic emplotment of this story over 200 years, where American freedom on one level, there's a teleology to it, because at every stage, freedom from, freedom to, freedom over, and then in some sense, even the sort of climate-based freedom is an extension of freedom over everything else. It's freedom not just over the people, but all of the creatures and life in the world that maybe even extends beyond the planet. So this freedom thing is just this constantly engorging and sort of ever more, in some ways, imperial, sort of as connected to the United States. So it gets bigger and bigger. But the moments of transition are really interesting, because they're basically the Civil War and the Second World War. So far, leaving aside this like uncertain moment now. Right. And those are both moments where, if you think about, in your paper focusing on the sort of presidential leadership, basically, it's like all of these moments present opportunities for like the engorgement of American power in a sort of ever more sort of top-down way. But there are also moments, if you think about it from sort of Michaela's perspective, of like who are the other actors that are driving change or articulating ideologies, or Melani's paper or Imaobong's paper, or even to some extent Daniel's paper, like sort of the people outside of the sort of the high halls of state leadership. These are also moments of kind of, obviously, as this is in the spirit of Penny's point, of immense kind of liberation, right, from below. I mean, these are like the most sort of radical moments in American history, where you have, the Second American Revolution. You have the abolition democracy and sort of the Black freedom struggle. I was literally just reading in Harry Haywood's Black Bolshevik, where he remembers, this is in Imaobong, connected to Imaobong's paper, where he remembers like his grandparents who were slaves, his parents who were slaves, his grandparents who were slaves, and the Union Army coming and like forcing the master to like cook them dinner. And this is this moment of incredible sort of revolutionary transformation. And same thing to a certain extent with the New Deal, labor movement, the kind of war against fascism, Popular Front, all these radicalisms that in your kind of schema get transformed in this kind of ironic emplotment into kind of American power bulldozing the world. So I guess I just wonder about whether that is the most, for me, I don't know if I find that the most useful way to sort of see this picture, where it's kind of like every sort of struggle, in Frederick Douglass's terms, every sort of moment of struggle and progress only leads to sort of further consolidation of this octopus-like American power. That may be partly true, but there is this history of contestation that also produced these transitions. So I guess to turn that long comment into a question, I would be interested in you to talk about these transitions, because you kind of just like line break, and then it's like, and then freedom to arrive. So like, is there a history of those transitional moments that's relevant to you? And then I guess I would ask the other panelists, and if I guess especially Imaobong and Melani, to talk about to what extent do you see in I mean, your papers aren't as wide-ranging, but I guess Melani sort of answered this already, like, no. but I mean, Jeremi said, the first footnote is like, in Jewish history, freedom's so important. But I mean, that's canonical for African American history, that, literally people teach courses on the Black freedom struggle. I mean, do you see that as a deeper current in, whether it's African American, whether it's Black internationalism, or whether it's Black nationalist politics? Do you guys buy that term for basically Black history in the U.S.? Okay, sorry.
So I'll speak quickly because I really want to hear what others have to say about this. Those were great comments. So I do think that transitional moments matter a lot, and I have more to say about them. I also need to think about them more. I've long thought that war, and I don't think this, right? That war is generative of all kinds of changes, and so intentionally all the transitional moments, including the Iraq War, are wars. This actually goes back to earlier work I did with Power and Protest and other projects. I mean, I think what you see in these moments, this has long been at least my argument, right, which is that in these moments of liberation and radicalism, there is a tendency toward the use and the deployment of radical ideas in ways that actually support the growth of American power. In fact, that is the most successful way to get ahead as a radical movement in the United States. It's not always what they want, but that's the irony of '68, right? The argument I made in Power and Protest is, right, '68 actually produces and reinforces in some way the work that Kissinger and Nixon are doing, that there is a relationship between what's going on in Berkeley and Wuhan and the opening to China, which brings us to the world we're in now. And the people Penny writes about so well, who stick to their radicalism, we need to tell those stories, but they often become less policy influential because they don't play in, when they don't play into the sort of growth of American power. That might change now, but I think that's a fair assessment of the last 200 years, but it doesn't mean we should elide the counter-narratives and the counter opportunities that people pursue. I'm looking to understand how the ideology influences policymaking. That does not have to be everyone's question, right? So Steve Hahn's work on African-American activism in the late 19th century, I think it's fascinating. A lot of it actually doesn't connect to policymaking. That doesn't mean it's not worth writing about, but it's a different set of questions.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Melani's point. I think freedom is a sort of big meta-narrative, but there are other key words I think are also really important. Self-determination, which I mentioned, resistance also. So they're all kind of interconnecting, I would say, but I wouldn't kind of, I wouldn't put too much weight on freedom, in my opinion.
And I don't know if this applies to me, but I'll give it a shot. Clearly positive and negative freedom are all over these debates. And clearly it also has significant impact about where we are with the development of the American welfare state, for instance, or the development of the labor movement and its claims, progressive rights and so forth. So, for instance, it's not brand new. It's not emerging as a fresh debate about, okay, so actually take a step back. The most virtuous immigrants for many of these ideological camps are those who only want negative freedom. It's when the migrants who might need freedom to things makes them immediately suspect for some key camps here. And that only grows as the welfare state expands. But it's there very early. So the LPC clause, so for the non-immigration wants this, the likely to become a public charge clause, is there early. As soon as you have the nationalizing of federal immigration regulation, that emerges quickly. And so that's a worry from the start, but it becomes much more significant in the narratives that are being bandied about immigrants, and especially the negative tropes about immigrants as being dependent, so it's not an attack on immigrants writ large, it's on those who might need certain things. So that's, Sybil Fox, Through Worlds of Relief is a great book to look at if you want more on this.
Jay?
Real quick, I love the panel. A quick one for Imaobong and Daniel. For Imaobong, I just read a thesis about Claudia Jones, which I'm sure you know everything there is to know about her, but the argument of it was that the political activism was running dry, wasn't working after 1945, and that Claudia Jones turned to more of a cultural expression. This was where the true legacy lied. I just wondered if there's mileage in that argument with Jones, but also with some of the others that you've looked at. And then, Daniel, I love the idea of how immigration policy, immigration reform is such a tough nut to crack, and it requires the stars aligning for these different sort of interest groups coming together. And I wondered if, as a political scientist, since you set yourself up for this, if there was a way that you could step back and
I have an
tell us-
AJCs I want it.
Yeah, give us the slide about what are the dependent and independent factors that go into that. I mean, my hypothesis as a historian would be that really immigration policy in those moments of reform mapped rather closely onto moments of geopolitical change and flux. So in the world of the conference there might tell us a lot about the domestic policy-making process of immigration reform. So I wondered if there was mileage in that.
So I would maybe disagree with that thesis. I think change over time is really important when thinking about Claudia James and also movement. So by the 1960s or 50s, she's actually in London and she's being a really powerful activist for kind of black British citizens and their rights and the kind of ways in which immigration debate comes up and the experiences
And
of
the
West
Notting Hill
Indians.
Carnival, is it?
Pardon?
The Notting Hill?
Yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
which comes out of the kind of racist treatment of blacks in Britain, right?
Yes.
So I think
Yeah.
actually there's a powerful continuity actually in her political activism, and I think that also comes about because she moves to London in that period. So I would kind of disagree with the thesis that was presented about culture. I think there's a good link between the culture and the political
I
activism.
passed it, sorry.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
So a non-political scientist, Alan Simpson, the former Wyoming senator,
Sure,
would
sure.
say there is no science to this. You can't come up with a neat explanation, and he would argue, and I interviewed him a long time ago, and one of his famous metaphors he used for the Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86 was that, because it had died so many times. He and Mazzoli had like a version that almost passed in '82, but didn't pass, '83, '84, and he said in '86 he was like a corpse that had the big CSI with the blanket put over it and was being wheeled out of the Senate with him in tears, and all of a sudden the corpse began to twitch. Okay? So he would say it's just, all of a sudden it's the stars aligning, but you can't predict when they do that. Well, yeah, I'm a political scientist, so I'll go a little further than Alan Simpson, which is geopolitics, yes, in many cases, and so we could point to certain things, think about, what finally pushes through
Sure.
the literacy test and the quota laws, and so you can think about those components of the First World War, and then the First Red Scare, and so forth, and Savage Peace, as a famous book puts it. But then, fast forward to '65, the 50s, certain reforms in the '60s is, the Cold War civil rights story and other kind of crucial Cold War imperatives going on. '86 is harder to make those kind of arguments. There are things you could find. So for me, there's actually key geopolitical stories around it, but also really important domestic political components of this. And not surprisingly, given what I was pointing to during my talk, a lot of it has to do with very careful coalition building. And those stars we're talking about is certain key actors who make a shift. So for instance, organized labor is a really, you could focus on them as an example of this, where you see them, basically in the late 19th century as a movement wrestling. It's a book that James Fine and I are finishing up now. We have some articles on this. Really kind of fascinating where the movement is at that point. And so there's a lot of infighting about what to do about immigration. And then they make a decisive shift. And that ends up being really crucial in terms of the alignments, so that they crazily join all these Brahmin on this issue, right? By the time you get to the post World War II era and so forth, a lot of it has to do with the labor movement's construction itself. And so AFL all of a sudden is being challenged by the CIO. The CIO has a very different approach on these sorts of questions. So by the time the AFL-CIO merged, they've taken completely different positions on these things. So you can track, basically the key coalitional actors in this as well. And then, it's a conference on ideas as expertise matters a whole hell of a lot, and that shifts over time. So I keep going, but those are, by the way, my, if you're talking to political scientists in certain departments, they would say, no, what's the one thing? And I don't go there.
Are we under big time pressure, or we could relax a little bit about it? All right. So I want to go to the very back because you've been trying to get in for a while. Yeah.
I have a question on freedom. How flexible or how free are we to have a different viewpoint of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and our support for the Saudis, considering our relationship between the U.S. and the Saudis since World War II? what's aligning our continued support? Are we producing more energy now? The Senate has bipartisan suggestion that we not sell the Saudis these weapons. How flexible? How come we're boxed in?
It's a great example, and it's actually one I've been thinking about, because I think it actually reinforces what I'm trying to say, which is that at any given moment for American foreign policy, there are competing claims on freedom, right? There are competing groups, and you obviously have, and I do too, have a vision that if we're really about freedom, we would be helping the Yemenis who were being bombed with our weapons by the Saudis and others, right? But the way we have defined freedom in the use of our foreign policy since 1945 is about creating what we see as systems that we believe, or that the policymakers argue, are creating free conditions, even if those conditions on the ground are not being met at every single moment. So there is a belief, this is what you would hear if you, even if you went to Obama people, not just Trump people, and asked them about the Middle East, they would say we have a system of protecting freedom defined in economic and political terms in the Middle East, and the Saudis are a key player. And it is more important that we support Saudi Arabia than it is that we support the Yemenis on the ground. We would try to push the Saudis to do something different. And that's why the Obama administration didn't do very much about this problem. This is not a Trump administration problem. This is an Obama administration problem. To think that that's not an argument for freedom is, I think, to miss the way this is actually talked about and thought about by policymakers. It would be very easy if we could expose the people who aren't thinking about freedom. It's actually that they have a cohesive ideology of freedom that justifies the uses of power that on a day-to-day basis don't seem to affirm the free conditions that you want to see. And that's what makes it hard to compete against this. And if you were to go make the claim to Congress even that we should be helping the Yemenis, the response you would get is free enterprise, the free system in the Middle East requires American cooperation with the Saudis. They give you an anti-terrorism argument, they give you an argument for energy, et cetera, down the line. I'm not justifying those. I'm simply saying that is the architecture of policy making. And I think it connects to what Penny was talking about in terms of corporate power. Right?
I want to go back to the exchange that Dan and Jeremy were having about freedom and positive freedom and negative freedom, and throw in religious freedom to that conversation. Because I think that actually goes against what you were just saying. And I was wondering, as I was reading the framework that you were doing, just generally, Jeremy, how you put how religious freedom fits into that schema. I think the work of someone like Tisa Winger might actually really help you.
I'm not familiar with it.
It's what is it titled? Religious freedom. It's with UNC a couple years ago.
I'm not familiar with it.
It's great.
Can you send me the
it
reference?
works on religious freedom and empire building.
Okay.
So there's some really great stuff in there. But I mean, there's obviously a lot of work on religious freedom and foreign relations. It similarly has the sort of, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And I wondered sort of how you would throw religious freedom into the picture. You say in the four freedoms, religious freedom is obvious. I don't know how much it is actually. That's right.
So elaborate for that.
And then for immigration too, when how does sort of, you were saying sort of when it's sort of people are going to be needing something, sort of that seems to be making them sort of less likely to be getting support for. They're going to be needing.
No, to clarify. So for certain categories, okay. So in particular, classic, restrictionists, there's a certain route that they're giving, but it becomes a much stronger part of their narrative about why new immigrants are undesirable over time. Okay, you will find other camps that would make a strong argument for why that's not consequential. In other words, that need could be a strong reason why. Right, so obviously there's a huge difference when I talk about the AJC, American Jewish Committee. There's a whole host of groups, the Lutheran Office of Refugee Relief. So there's a whole host of NGO religious groups who would not be subscribing to the negative view on that at all. Actually, I should be careful with using the word negative because it gets a little confusing. Who would not have a problem? In fact, would make an argument on why it's absolutely crucial to be welcoming refugees who are escaping religious persecution, and why they're going to need more. So that's why, in fact, our refugee laws, had within it the largest, most expansive kind of benefits programs and relocation programs within it. Does that help a bit in clarifying?
I think it does, yeah. So they'd be in that fourth quadrant of your...
So like AJC and other folks would totally be in the liberal cosmopolitan category.
Got it.
It doesn't mean that there aren't religious folks who populate a lot of these, and there's a longer conversation. When I spent time, going through archives and talking to, for instance, New Christian Right folks, they're not a one stripe on this, not surprisingly. And so, and there's a whole move by the National Immigration Reform, for instance, where their effort is to try to win over more folks from the right for comprehensive immigration reform. May seem like pushing the rock up the mountain, but their thing is, it's the 3 Bs: business, badges, so business is business, badges is law enforcement, and Bibles. And so they have a number of prominent evangelicals, and actually, depending on what moment you want to weigh in, take the Immigration Act of 1990, which increases legal immigration by 40%, and unlike 65, explicitly welcomes family reunification as being a way of diversifying those visas. Religious groups are crucial. There's always been mainstream groups that have been behind that reform, and they were pushing. We can have a long conversation about what's happening in the 30s with refugee relief on this. But fast forward, that there you also have Christian right folks, like the Family Forum, saying it's families. And so that's when the W. Bush people say, oh, maybe we don't want to resist this. So it's a longer conversation. It's nuanced. Yeah.
So it's a great question to ask about religious freedom, and you know more about this than I do, as Andrew's not here, and we're here, and Ray, so many of you have written about this. From where I'm coming from, I think of, actually, I have a student writing a dissertation on this now, on the creation of the Office of Religious Freedom at the State Department, right? Which is created in the 1990s, actually, right? It's really interesting, right? And it's on my mind because she's writing a dissertation, so I've been reading it. Why is the office created? What is it? The first time that the State Department cares about religious freedom? Why is that office created? It's created because there's a sense after the Cold War that the United States not only has a mission to support religious freedom, but now has the power and legitimacy to actually go in and enforce religious freedom. And in fact, some of the language is about enforcing religious freedom, and then you get into these debates as to how are we enforcing it. That's literally what she's documenting. How do we force people to be religiously free? Right? And it seems like a caricature until you're actually reading it. And by the way, this goes on through Republican and a Democratic administration. It's not partisan at that moment. Clinton really wants to champion this issue as well. And so that's where I come at this, right? The story of both the importance of religion to American foreign policy and religious groups like those you write about, that's an old story. But the fusion with state power and the fusion with the official apparatus of foreign policy, that's not an old story, right? And to me, I'm at the level, I mean, it depends which level we're talking about, right? So 19th century, you would see some of that, but in a much more informal way, right? In the early 20th century, it gets a little more formalized, but by the second half of the 20th century, it gets more and more embedded in the actual architecture and making of foreign policy as such. And so that's where I see the schema for freedom intersecting with these other dynamics around thinking about religion and freedom. And the reason I said it was obvious in FDR's case, it's not obvious what he means by that, but it is obvious that Americans think that what differentiates our society from others is that people are free to choose their religion, right? It's also ironic. It's about that time that FDR learns about Holocaust also. And of course, we'll not talk about that in the same way. So there's an irony there, there's a consciousness of it, and there's a shifting occurring in the way in which that consciousness is now being deployed with state power. And that's sort of what I'm getting at.
Can I just say something? So I wrote in my book about the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 in some detail, and then, as with a lot of other things, there was even more. The book was even longer when I originally submitted it, and I will say that I think that we'd have to think about that in the ways that people are talking about as complicated, not only because of the question of who gets religious freedom, which is what Tissa Winger has written about and others, about what kinds of religions are even visible as religions and therefore legible to people. This is something Talal Assad wrote about many decades ago, the way in which certain kinds of faith is aspirational, affirmational, I believe this, and other kinds of faith practices are not oriented as much around that and therefore less visible. That's one thing. But the other more direct piece around US foreign policy is that when IRFA was passed in 1998, which is when the Office of Religious Freedom was founded, 3 countries were particularly interested, activists who were behind it, and this was the activists who were involved in this called themselves a grass tops movement. They weren't exactly grassroots, but they weren't exactly mainstream policymakers either. So they sort of jokingly defined themselves that way. But they were, and they knew that when religious freedom policy was going to be enacted in that period, there would be 3 countries that would be of interest primarily, and lots of places were relevant, but Sudan, China, and Saudi Arabia. And that the president would have to either, if these countries, any country was labeled as a violator of religious freedom through the elaborate policy that they had, then the president would have to either, then sanctions could be imposed, and then the president would have to either accept or waive those sanctions. And everybody knew that whatever was going to happen on Sudan would happen. China would get sanctions, and every year, sanctions would be waived on Saudi Arabia. Like that is going to happen over and over again, and it happened across Democrats and Republicans. And so it comes back to that question of like, when does freedom, when is religious freedom actually an issue, and when is it a weapon?
Yep. Well, very quickly, I was going to say this issue of FDR and on religious freedom is striking because that's where you see therein lies the rub of you have all of these grassroots religious groups that are pressuring for refugee relief in the face of fascist forces in Europe, and their leaders, clergy and so forth, and Eleanor Roosevelt's with them, and Helen Hayes, and Henry Fonda and so forth, and FDR isn't going to commit to it. So it's a lot like the anti-lynching story. Why? Because within his own party are those who are saying, charity starts at home. We don't want to bring in people who are going to be, taking jobs, demanding relief and so forth. So that's where you can see the collision between those forces and then the mix of ideas. Does that help with that? Yeah, okay.
I'm told we're kind of done. But conversations can continue. There's one thing that I kind of wish could morph into maybe the session that we're doing toward the end, because I felt like you were putting on the table issues about intersectionality, thinking about isms and internationalisms being thought of not as these separable things, but in a kind of plurality. And I feel like that's a tension that's running through a lot of this. David, we were talking about how do you organize this volume, these keywords, what you do, freedom becomes like the uber keyword in that, again, not to pick on you, Jeremy, but just as a way of thinking about that. But what happens when you start to think about ideas and practice and the kind of everyday entanglements of them? And so the lifting the stuff out, what's gained and lost in terms of, again, thinking about this more sort of granular texture. It seems like maybe it's the last meeting where that's good to have out on the table, but you put it there, and we didn't take it up, and I think we ought to. That's great. In a way. So, thank you.